Also, during the adjournments, please switch off your equipment, because people may want to have private conversations with their colleagues in the adjournments, and it's not appropriate for those to be filmed. And finally, if at any time I consider that filming is becoming disruptive or inhibiting the discussion, I shall ask you to cease. Okay, I'll now ask Ms Saunders to go through the emergency evacuation procedures.
Thank you, Ms Graham. Yes, the fire alarm isn't for today, so when an alarm does sound, it will sound continuously and we will need to leave the building. We can leave either through the door here in Committee Room 1 or the door in the end of Committee Room 2. We can take either the stairs around our right and down and out of the building, or we can use the stairs outside the council chamber to leave the building at the front. We make our way to St Mary's Passage and congregate opposite Senate House. Obviously, officers will be around to help in the event that an alarm does sound.
Thank you. Could I remind anyone who has a mobile phone with them to please make sure that it's switched off while the hearing is in session, and also to ask you all to sign the attendance list, which I think is just outside the door. Now, I'll aim to have a short break mid-morning and mid-afternoon, should we still be here then, and break for lunch at about 1 o'clock. I'll now ask those participating to briefly introduce themselves. I know you were all here yesterday, but we'll go through the process again. So, Ms Hartley.
Thank you. I'm Amy Hartley, I'm from Deloitte, and I'm here representing the Grand Arcade Partnership, which is owned by investors who run HMC Limited and a Grand Arcade Shop Limited, as well as other landholdings within.
Thank you. Now, I can't ask the empty chair next to you to introduce themselves. We were uncertain whether Mr Lampard was going to attend today, but he's not here, so there we are. So,
Stephen Miles, Planning Policy for Cambridge City Council.
Sarah Saunders, Planning Policy Manager at City Council.
thank you. Turning then to the agenda for today, which follows the matters and issues that I drew up. I'm aware that there is an overlap between some of the matters identified here and the matters and issues we dealt with under Matter 4. I apologise for that, but I will take all comments into account in coming to conclusions on these issues. So the first first issue relates to the threshold that's included in the plan for an impact assessment of any proposals outside the city centre. It's set in the plan at the same level as the default in the NDPF, but views have been expressed that it should be at a lower level. Ms Hartley.
Thank you. Yes, I think it was the view of ourselves and also previous owners of the Grafton Centre, MG, both set forward in representations that we would like to see the retail impact assessment threshold reduced to 1,000 square metres rather than 2,500. We would just like to set out that retail has an important economic role in Cambridge City Centre, and importantly, its strengths should not be taken for granted. Especially in the changing retail environment that there is at the moment. There are many challenges, such as the increase in online shopping, the number of administrations, and many retailers are right-sizing their real estate portfolios, and looking at actually their physical footprint and whether they need as many stores within their retail locations as they have. And it's our view that you should take care to protect the city centre in the long term, especially from cumulative impacts. The units within the city centre are obviously smaller and it has a special character that's worth protecting. We acknowledge the evidence base, which I believe is paragraph 9.49 of the retail study, which talks about not setting a blanket threshold, and it talks about having discretion within the policy. However, we do note that the retail study does state on page 61, I believe it's the fourth bullet, that there had been a marginal decline in market share since 2008, and this was as of the study in 2013. So I guess the question stands from us, has the council identified how market share is faring since 2013, and has this been taken into consideration? We also have concerns about the policy wording as it is at the moment, when it talks about the council have discretion in setting out, talking to developers and setting out whether there should be a lower threshold for the retail impact assessment. At the moment, I believe the policy just says it will look to see whether there's a cumulative impact coming forward, and then the council will take a view whether they will require a retail impact assessment. And I wondered whether, in light of the MPPG, which was published afterwards, it does set out in paragraph 16 that in setting a locally appropriate threshold, the different things that will be important to consider. So there's 6 bullet points, such as the scale of proposals relative to the town centre, whether the town centre is a vulnerable, impact on planned investment. So A, whether the council will be considering all of those bullet points when they're talking to developers in terms of whether the retail impact assessment needs to be submitted, and also the use of the discretion creates a bit of uncertainty in the process. So those are our concerns and those are our questions.
Thank you.
Just to start off by setting the context, the retail study 2013 indicates that Cambridge city centre is broadly a healthy city centre in retail terms. It has a high quality shopping environment and low vacancy rates. You can find those points and a few others on pages 34 and 35 of RDE 130. The retail study does recognise that the market share has fallen a little bit in the city centre and has increased a little bit in retail warehousing out of centre. That's recognised on page 61 as Hartley notes, and also in paragraph 7.49 on page 57. So the retail study did recognise this concern and still came to the conclusion set out in paragraphs 949 and 950 that a blanket threshold wasn't appropriate. A blanket threshold lower than 2,500 square metres wasn't appropriate, and that lower threshold for convenience comparable space in certain circumstances where the concerns are cumulative impact and or the role of health of the nearby centres. So that's the recommendation from the consultant's retail report, and that's what we carried through into the plan, pretty much word for word. Turning to Hartley's questions, the council hasn't done any further detailed retail work since this retail study back in 2013, and so we haven't done any further work on market share. With regards the council's discretion over when to apply a lower threshold, we've tried to be as clear as possible in the policy in bringing forward the recommendation from the consultants So to read from the policy, retail impact assessment may be required below this threshold where a proposal could have a cumulative impact or an impact on the role or health of nearby centres within the catchment or proposal. We also encourage applicants to engage in early discussions with the council in paragraph 2.67 to help them get certainty as to whether they need to look at an impact assessment or not. We think the policy is flexible, but also provides some certainty as to when a lower threshold will be considered. The PPG does have 6 bullet points, which says when a low impact test should be considered. We think 2 of them certainly are covered within the text of the policy, where we talk about the cumulative impact or the impact on role and health of nearby centres. That being the 2nd and 4th bullet point of the impact test. So those are the ones which are flowed from the evidence base and which we would focus on when looking at a lower threshold. But that isn't to say we wouldn't look at the other points as well.
If I could just add as well, just the point about, have we updated our evidence base since the 2013 update? And as Mr. Miles says, no, we haven't, and we've not had a need to or a reason to at this point in time. There hasn't been any evidence or applications since we prepared the plan that have given us concern in order for us to consider updating our evidence base, because obviously the plan has a monitoring framework and we produce annual monitoring reports, and it would be picked up through that, which would trigger us the need to look at our evidence base. And certainly through the examination sessions, we've not had anything substantial from any of the objectives that have triggered us to say at this point in time, it triggers us to update that part of the retail study.
Ms. Hartley.
I think on that basis, the council hasn't told us anything that we don't know or that we weren't already aware of. So in terms of the update to the retail evidence base, I'll come back to that more in the second question that we'll be dealing with today. It's about we're talking about that there, but I would just say that our concerns and what we've set out for these still stand in my view, because we haven't been offered anything different than we've already set out as concerns.
Okay, can I just ask you then, what you consider are the factors which would justify a lower threshold than the default set out in the NPPF? Because I've done a number of examinations now where councils have put forward a lower threshold and have come in for a lot of criticism as a result. And in some circumstances the justification was that their main centre was not doing very well and didn't have significant numbers of multiple retailers, and it was felt that the smaller local retailers would suffer an impact. One particular example was Bexhill. Now there's a huge difference between Bexhill and Cambridge, so I'm just interested to understand from you what would justify this lower threshold in Cambridge.
Thank you. Yes, I appreciate the differences between the size of the two centres, and as you picked out, I think in terms of both for us, and it was, I can't speak for M&G, but they obviously set out their concerns of the Grafton and the number of vacant units that were in there, and sort of the health of the Grafton Centre in their previous representations. And I think it just goes back to the points that I was saying earlier. in terms of the strength of the centre should not be taken for granted, because although it's, performing relatively strongly, which it said back in 2013, and the retail environment has changed since then. It shouldn't be taken for granted, and there are many challenges facing retailers, and I think the challenges are only going to get worse as the growth in online retailing, as anticipated, continues. Also, consumer expectations are changing in terms of retail and what they want, as well as how they shop. So for us, it's a view in terms of the long-term protection of the city centre and the cumulative impacts from applications coming forward from out-of-centre locations beneath that threshold. Numerous applications for 2,000 square metres, etc. It's about the long-term impacts, and that would be our concern. And also, we'd want to make sure that there isn't a further decline in market share, which it said that the retail study said there had been.
So one of the factors that's leading you to this conclusion that it should be a lower level is a concern about the cumulative effect of a number of smaller schemes. Okay, and I understand your other points as well. Do you want to add?
Quick point of order, Inspector. Can I ask Mrs. Hartley, please speak into the microphone, because I can't hear you myself in the speakers. I'm really having trouble listening.
We'll try and use.
Thank you.
We'll try and use the microphones.
I think our position remains the same in relation to our evidence base, and I take Mrs. Hartley's point, but we've not had anything tangible where we can respond to that coming forward as part of the evidence here, or anything that we've picked up as part of planning applications and monitoring of those planning applications. We often do respond to evidence submitted by objectors as part of the examination, where we consider them to be reasonable and act on that, but nothing's been shared with us as part of this process for it to trigger us to look at what's in our study in more detail and provide an update to that. That's not to say through monitoring in the future that our monitoring framework's in place, through annual monitoring reports, that it wouldn't trigger us to review our retail and leisure study, and in particular the issue of threshold for retail impact assessments. So we do think our monitoring framework covers that. And I'll just draw your attention at the moment to that in Appendix M on page 398 to 399. That sets out in relation to Policy 6 the implementation issues, and it specifically draws out the issue with the threshold and the retail impact assessment and what we would do in those circumstances. It's probably worth me just noting that is also subject to review, and again we can review that as part of reviewing the monitoring framework. But I do think there are some appropriate hooks in there at the moment that would allow to deal with that long-term scenario that Mrs. Hartley's talked about. And just a point of hopefully helpful clarification, in L&G's statement that they submitted, they do talk about the current health of the Grafton Centre and explain that paragraph 1.8 that the centre is fully operational with a high occupancy rate, and retailers on leases with significant periods to run. So they consider the centre at the moment to be healthy, which is why they're looking to take forward the improvements to the centre they are at the moment.
Okay, fine. I think we've probably explored that issue as far as we can. So, moving on to the second issue, which is whether the level of comparison retail floor space capacity, which is included in the policy, is up to date, reflecting current need. Miss Hartley.
Thank you. Is that loud enough? Yeah. Thank you. Essentially, as you set out previously, Ms Graham, that we have submitted a statement in regard to matter 4, which covers some of these issues, so I won't draw into detail on these in particularly, but they did raise concerns in particular about the growth in the special forms of trading and the concerns about that in terms of the impact that would have on reducing capacity. One point I would like to note is that within the policy it talks, obviously provides the figure of 14,141 square metres, but within the retail study it does say that this forecast should be treated as an upper limit, reflecting uncertainties over the effect of wider developments on capacity, excuse me, and the level of growth in special forms of trading, particularly online spending. So, and it seems to be, it's recognised in the policy, it does talk about uncertainty, especially the long-term growth forecasts. So essentially our questions then lead to, obviously this study is dated May 2013, we're now in July 2016, the plan is going to be adopted, I presume, subject to this hearing later this year, early next year. That's already 4 years since the evidence base was produced. We'll be nearly halfway to the 2022 point in which it talks about bringing forward that capacity figures are based. No updates, the council have confirmed that no updates have come forward, and they've said that there's no need for that, but I guess our concern comes from that the retail study acknowledges that it's an uncertain time and that there are challenges, and it's hard to forecast those long-term assumptions as well as treating the figures as upper limits. So that uncertainty to us suggests that actually there should be more monitoring and there should be more evidence, more updates in the evidence base to make sure that actually the figures that are quoted are actually correct for the present retail environment. So I guess one question is, the council does talk about timescales for the next review of the evidence base, and I wonder what those timescales are. And then another question that I had, obviously a lot of the retail is based on population projections and forecasts in terms of capacity and people and spend. Given the work that's been undertaken in terms of housing numbers, and obviously therefore having an impact on the population projections, has there been any review, or is there likely to be a review of those figures in the retail study in light of those changes and what the implications are? And we've set out previously within our representations that given the uncertainty that the council should regularly monitor the health of the city centre, because it's our concern if floor space figures are too high, then it leaves the city centre susceptible to out-of-town retail to provide the additional capacity. Thank you.
Thank you.
Mr Miles will start and then pick up on your questions.
So again, I'd like to start by setting the context for the retail study and the comparison capacity forecast coming out of it. Retail study is produced by GVA, who are reputable retail consultants. Further detail on how the forecast for comparison retail capacity was arrived at on pages 58 to 60 of the study. Baseline forecasts were produced to inform the plans of climate to meet retail needs of the city, and the baseline forecasts indicate capacity of nearly 40,000 square metres to 2031. I think it's important to remember that while they do look at 2 other scenarios, both of those scenarios being looking at lower estimates of capacity, the the baseline forecasts are the ones which they think is the most likely thing that's going to happen in the future, and they do indicate capacity of 40,000 square metres to 2031. That said, they do recognise a lot of uncertainties in retail that's happening at the moment, not least the growth in online trading, special forms of trading. So they undertook 2 sensitivity tests, one looking at whether wider developments would come forward, drugs would come forward in the wider area. The 3 they looked at were those in Peterborough, Huntingdon and Northstowe, which would claw back some of that capacity in Cambridge, and that led to a growth capacity of 21,000 square metres by 2031. And then the other one, the other scenario included those wider developments and then an increase in online trade, special forms of trading from 16% to 20%, and that indicated a capacity of 12,000 square metres to 2031. So there is a lot of uncertainty about these retail forecasts, and the consultants in advising the council to take into account that uncertainty told us to plan for the advisors to plan for the retail growth to 2022 from the baseline forecasts, which is the 14,000 square metres which Ms. Hartley notes and which is in the plan. We think that, that we follow that advice, and that's what we brought through in the plan. We think it's a relatively clear approach which is based on the evidence base. Obviously, the monitoring report and the monitoring framework which Ms. Saunders was talking about in relation to the previous questions will be a way for the council to understand whether the floor space is being delivered as expected. In terms of it being treated as an upper limit, the study does recommend that it's treated as an upper limit, and that isn't something that we've followed through in the plan.
But what we have recognised in paragraph 265 is what the study advises in relation to the uncertainty in forecasting over the plan period, and the council should not plan to meet the identified capacity to 2031, but should focus on meeting capacity to 2022. So the study outlines, as Mr. Miles said, those issues and goes through that sensitivity testing, makes a recommendation based on the sensitivity testing, and we followed that through in the policy. But I think importantly, we've recognised in the supporting text that there are some uncertainties over forecasting, but based on our evidence base, this is the sensible approach to take forward. And as part of that, we recognise that it will be subject to monitoring over the plan period, and that includes monitoring of the wider developments in the sub-region, which the sensitivity testing were part of. And again, as we mentioned, that's also picked up in the monitoring framework. So based on our evidence base and the advice from the consultants specialising in retail and preparing that evidence base, we think we've taken that forward in an appropriate way that's also compliant with the requirements in the NPPF, which requires us to undertake need assessments, for them to be done in a particular way, which takes into account forecasting, and also make sure that we've got then the appropriate policies and hooks within those policies to make provision for future comparison of floor space.
And the implication of including a figure in the plan to 2022 is presumably that you're going to have to review that policy at an early stage. And we discussed in a previous session that you're committing yourselves to preparing a joint plan with South Cambridgeshire. to start in 2019. So presumably you will either review your retail policies through that new plan, or if that is taking a long time, you will have to do a specific review of these policies, because otherwise you're going to have a policy vacuum.
Absolutely. I was going to come on to that point about preparing a joint plan and the commitment through the city deal to prepare a joint plan with South Cambridgeshire in 2019. In terms of where we are on timescales, 2016 now, we may not get to be in a position to adopt the plan until 2017, and we will effectively probably be into preparing for that new joint plan and looking at what evidence base needs to be prepared, and the return and leisure study and the new one, the joint one with South Cambridgeshire, would need to be prepared as part of that in order to be compliant with national policy. Alongside that, while preparation starts for a new plan, there's also the monitoring framework that, subject to monitoring and anything coming forward through the monitoring of applications, that could also trigger us to make sure that there's an early review and a study that's updated to inform any issues that may be coming forward that we might see at the change in circumstances. So we do feel that it's covered through the plan, what we've outlined in the plan and the framework, but also as part of the new joint plan and the commitment to that in the future.
Thank you. I think I'd say that the point about the upper limit still obviously concerns us in terms of it not being in the policy, and the policy being less detailed in terms of recognising what the challenges and what the uncertainties are. And I guess just in terms of, and that being an upper limit, in terms of the monitoring that you're currently undertaking, what is that showing at the moment in terms of the amount of retail that's coming forward in terms of in order to meet that capacity? Again, just bringing back to the point in terms of if it can't be, if it's not being met in the city centre, it leaves it vulnerable to out of centre. So I'm just interested in terms of what it's currently showing as to whether to reflect that should be an upper limit, because if it's not looking like it might be met by 2022.
I think anything that's come forward through our annual monitoring to give rise to concern. In fact, I think there's been very few applications coming forward across the board in terms of retail provision. I think it comes back to the same position. I think we're taking an appropriate approach based on the study, and the supporting text provides an explanation. I would draw your attention to, as part of our previous statement of common ground with M&G, we did agree some modifications with them that were put in 2014 that just clarified the position in relation to the level of uncertainty and made clear that the uncertainty included the short to medium term to reflect the evidence base. And we put forward through the statement of common ground, should you want to look at those modifications again. And we think that it's been appropriate for us to recognise in the supporting text the position that's come through our evidence base. Should you have any concerns about the figure that we've planned for and taken forward into the policy, obviously the study looks at the sensitivity, does some sensitivity testing in the two scenarios that Mr. Miles went through. They're outlined in the study, and you may consider looking at those, that they might be more reasonable and more appropriate, but we considered, based on the forecasting that was done and the evidence in the study and what we take forward into the policy, that that's a sound position and a reasonable position to take. I probably do just need to pick up on Ms. Hartley's point about housing numbers and whether we considered it appropriate to update the study based on the changes to housing numbers. And I think it's just worth saying that the work the councils have undertaken for Cambridge, there's been no change to the objectively assessed need for housing. It still stands at 14,000 from the council's perspective, and for South Cambridgeshire there's been a very small change, increasing the objectively assessed need numbers from 19,000 to 19,500. So we don't consider that to be a large increase. Obviously there are challenges to those numbers and we've had discussions about those, but from the council's perspective, the work that's been done, the changes in South Cambridgeshire, we haven't considered that then indicate there needs to be a change to the retail study or any other evidence base.
Thank you. I just have one further point to make in terms of Ms. Saunders saying that few applications have actually come forward for retail provision. In my mind, actually, that is a concern because, as I said, we're partly towards 2022, and therefore, how is that retail provision going to be met if there aren't any retail applications coming forward within the city centre for that retail floor space that's required? So that would be my point on that. That it's obviously an upper limit, and it appears as though there haven't been applications coming forward. So again, it's this point about challenges from out of town that I'm concerned about. Thank you.
Just saying in response to that, we obviously talked about yesterday with in relation to the proposals that Cambridge and LNG have two proposals that they want to bring forward, which will provide a significant amount of comparison floor space, and then through the SPD we will be looking at scoping out further areas in the longer term that could provide more comparison floor space. So we don't think that there's a trigger at this point for us to do any further work, but it is part of our annual monitoring, and we will continue to monitor the situation and respond to it in an appropriate and positive way. And we certainly have a track record of doing that with the monitoring that we've undertaken as part of our adopted plan. Our report, our annual monitoring report, monitors and goes through each chapter of the plan and each policy, and where there have been issues we have flagged them up and acted on them, and that may be in the case of providing further work. One example of that is in relation to particular issues over pubs and the protection and loss of pubs, but also where we may have had issues over the implementation or understanding of particular policies. An example of that is in relation to open space and the provision of open space. So I think we do have a good track record of monitoring appropriately and properly and acting on that.
It's also worth remembering that any application out of centimetre will be subject to the sequential day standard if they are over the impact threshold, or they would have a cumulative impact on the role and health of nearby centres, then also the impact test would be applied as well.
Okay, Ms. Hartley, is there anything else that you want to?
I think just acknowledging that the LNG and the Rent Bridge are obviously looking to bring forward proposals. Obviously, we don't know the scope at the moment in terms of they've indicated rough quantums for the overall, and I know they've discussed having different uses, whether it's at the upper level. So we're not able to comment on how much of a net increase of comparison floor space there will be from their proposals at this stage, because it might well be that there's a re-provision of existing rather than necessarily a net gain as they look to include other uses. So I guess at the moment from that point of view, because we're talking about applications that haven't come forward yet, we're obviously not quite sure that will entail, but my point about there being few applications so far still stands. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Well, I think we've covered the ground on the second point. Now, the third item on my agenda, I would have been looking at Mr. Lampard to start the discussion there, because this was specifically the point raised in the representations on behalf of his client. Obviously, I've read what they have to say. I've read the council's response. I shall go and have a look at the centre and come to a conclusion, but I don't think there's any questions that I have for you at the moment. And the same applies to the fourth issue that I originally identified. This was a representation brought forward by Waitrose. And they haven't submitted any additional written statement since their original objections. So of course I've read those and I've read your response, and similarly I don't think there's anything to pursue today. So that actually completes the agenda. Now, looking at the programme, we're now in a position where we don't have anyone who wants to appear on the sessions that we programmed for the rest of this week. So I've read the submissions and so on, and at the moment I don't have any further questions for the council. But of course, once I've done my site visits, I might have. But I'll contact you in writing through the programme officer in the usual way. There was just one matter that I wanted to raise. I know and I understand why you're carrying out further work on some of the housing policies, and you advised me of that previously. And there's also joint work going on in relation to the gypsy and traveller policies. It would be very helpful to me, and I'm not, this isn't intended as any pressure to do this work any more quickly than you can reasonably manage, but it would just help me to have some idea of when that work might be completed and when you're likely to be carrying out public consultation and so on. The reason is that the programme officer and I are now working on trying to put together the programme for the South Cambridgeshire specific hearings, which are going to take us well into next year. But as you can imagine, the planning inspectorate is very keen that when Mr Wood and I are not working on these plans, we're helping to clear the backlog of appeals, which I think everybody's aware of. So it would be very helpful for us to have just a rough indication of when we might be able to hold the hearing sessions in relation to those issues. And I don't want to put you on the spot now, but if you could, perhaps, respond through the programme officer when you can.
I'm happy to do that. I'm more than happy to because I recognise the need to update you, particularly in relation to the student accommodation, and in relation to that, I hadn't been until we got to a particular point. I was then hoping to provide you with a much sort of more detailed update, and that would include timescales for moving forward. I think it's just worth saying that since we wrote to you about the student accommodation issue and our intention to undertake a study at the end of March, on the back of that, Oxford City Council approached us about the potential of doing a joint study because they were experiencing similar issues, and we thought that was worthwhile. So we're currently appointing consultants at the moment who will undertake that work. Because it's involved Oxford, it's just taken a little bit longer than we had hoped, but that's underway. We're looking to appoint consultants, and we hope the work will be done the end of the summer through into the autumn, so that can report to us towards the end of the year. We can take stock of what's coming through the study, and then as appropriate look at relevant modifications including consultation, and we would look to do that at the start of next year with the intention of reporting back to you in March next year, because we're also conscious of the programme and the sessions in South Cambridgeshire that actually we would need to report back to you by a particular point in order for you to be able to have time to look at the work and then programme the sessions that would address those issues. So that's broadly what we're looking at, and I'm certainly happy to provide you with a more detailed written update, including a firmer timetable once we've just finished appointing consultants. And we can do that through the usual way through the programme officer.
Thank you. That would be very helpful, and I'll perhaps just make one point about the prospect of further modifications. It may be that Mr. Wood and I will come to the conclusion that further modifications may be required to ensure soundness, and if possible, it would be helpful to just have one further round of main modifications consultation. So when you've come to a view on when that work will be finished, and obviously I appreciate you'll probably want to undertake some form of consultation with stakeholders at that point, but it may be that we can come to a view about when it would be appropriate to carry out one further formal consultation on main modifications, so that you're not having to do it in dribs and drabs, and people are not having to deal with it in dribs and drabs as well.
I think that's really helpful, particularly in the context of the work that we're doing with the Gypsy and Travellers, which is work not just with South Cambridgeshire district, but actually that's with the other authorities as well, and that is close to completion. So I think actually what you say about modifications and consultation is important with where we are with that work and the implications coming out of that work, that we need to take stock of now and advise, sort of take view of where we are with that and what that means for modifications consultation sort of sooner than we would for the student accommodation study. So I think it's helpful to have that point now for us to be mindful of that.
Yes, I think that would be hopefully a useful way forward. But obviously with the Gypsy and Traveller work, well, I'm sure you've involved stakeholders in the process, but obviously you wouldn't want to leave consultation until the formal stage with a topic like that. But yes, okay, well that's it's been a useful discussion about the way forward on some of these things.
That's helpful, and I would just say there are some other strands of work that we're doing that relate to particular issues that have come up either through hearing sessions or as part of our statements that we're keeping a track of. And I think some of the Cambridge-only ones, for example, the Matter 4 session, no, the Matter 8 session in relation to delivery, there was an issue that came up about windfalls in Cambridge, and looking back at where those windfalls have come from, particularly in relation to employment sites, and that is something that we have been doing alongside the other work that we're conscious of, that we need to report and provide an update, wherever possible. We will look to do that over the next couple of months, but actually we can provide you with a sort of fuller update that would be helpful on a number of strands of work.
That would be really useful, and hopefully it won't take too much time out of having to actually do the work. I do appreciate that sometimes you can spend ages just writing updates rather than actually doing the work, but that's very useful. Thank you.